Okay, welcome everybody. I'm glad you could come tonight, or if you're online. I'd like to introduce Benjamin Barbie, who's visiting Red Lodge, his hometown, on safety leave from the NOAA Nancy Foster, right?
Yeah.
And due to COVID, the COVID virus, and was happy to volunteer to give us a presentation and share with us his experiences and knowledge from working on the research vessel.
All right. Thank you, Teresa. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I guess I'm right off the bat. I'm not a scientist, and so I'm a science technician. So I think for this talk I'll be sort of talking about just what the work environment is like on the ship and the kind of things that are entailed in my job, and then I've got some information on the products and data that we produce that the scientists do, but I'm much more a science support role and a member of the crew. We'll get started. The high seas, it was, a lot of people ask me, how does someone from Red Lodge, Montana end up out working on a NOAA ship, and I just really felt drawn to the water, and was interested in science for a long time. So I bounced around quite a bit, and then 2 years ago I was lucky to get a position on the ship, and it's been great. I feel like I've kind of won the lottery. So a lot of the pictures I have are sunrises, sunsets, fog, and some wildlife here and there. But we'll get started. So there's the flag of the NOAA fleet. It's flown by all our ships. NOAA is a large organization under the Department of Commerce. There are a number of different line offices. Things like the National Ocean Service, the National Marine Fisheries, the National Weather Service is the big one that most people think about. All the ships are operated under the Office of Marine, or the Office of Marine and Aviation Operations, and there are 15 ships and a number of aircraft, and Nancy Foster is one of those, and we support all of those line offices for their different projects. So here we have the NOAA ship Thomas Jefferson. It's a designated survey ship. One of the offices under NOAA is the Office of Coast Survey, and so they produce all the nautical charts for U.S. coastal waters. This is the NOAA ship, the Henry B. Bigelow. It's primarily a fishing vessel. It supports the National Marine Fisheries Service and a lot of their surveys in the Northeast. And here's the back. It's a large ship. You can see here's the fishing trawl doors, and then the ramp coming down here to bring the net up and down. This is the NOAA ship, the Ronald H. Brown. It's the largest ship in the fleet. It's about 275 feet long, and it can go over 40 days at a time. It circles the world. It does a lot of meteorological and oceanographic research. And then there is the Grand Dame, the Nancy Foster. She's 184 feet long, draws 11 feet, and primarily works in nearshore waters. She's very shallow draft, and so in rough seas it can get kind of dicey. She's primarily stays close to shore. Here she is leaving Charleston Harbor to get to work. So just to give you a rundown on the setup of the ship, we have the bridge. That's where, and there are some living quarters below. That's primarily where the officer corps operates from and lives. There's berthing for the crew on we call it the O1 deck, and then there's lab space and science crew in the middle here, and then the working deck is out back. So the Nancy Foster originally was built as a torpedo testing ship, built in the 90s for the Navy and operated out of Puget Sound. And so there's a lot of cranes and apparatus here, so she would put to sea with experimental torpedoes, launch them, and then recover them with ROVs. And NOAA, she was commissioned with NOAA in 2004, and so it's really a utilitarian ship, being a Navy ship, and so but she's stout and I think she looks great. There are still some torpedo tubes that you can see below the waterline. So here's the ship in dry dock. Just to give, here are the thrusters for maneuvering the ship, and then down here we have this little shark's fin here. That's a fairing that holds our sonar equipment, and then right here's the fairing for the sonar and the thruster. And I'm not sure if you can all see that here. There's welded up torpedo tubes. There are two of them, so they would head up there, find a long inlet in Puget Sound, shoot their torpedoes, and go pick them up. But after the Cold War ended, they didn't need so many. There's still the Navy still operates one. The Nancy Foster was YTT number 12. YTT number 10 is still in operation as a torpedo testing ship. And this is where I work. So on the ship, there's the command, which is the officer corps. There are the engineers. There's the deck department, and there are the stewards who feed and care for everyone. And then there's the survey department, and we sort of are the interface for the most part when we're conducting science operations with the science parties as they come aboard, and then and with the ship. And so it's a small space. It's about 14 by 14, I think, and so we have all our computer racks here. This is our data acquisition terminal here. I spend a lot of time standing in front of these computers. Then we have some data processing terminals, and then the scientists sort of spread out and take over everything else, and it just fills up with folks, and it's really busy. And then behind me in this picture, we have a large wet lab that the scientists will bring their own equipment and set up for operations. But for the most part, myself and my coworker, we're working here in the dry lab or heading out on deck. So I was thinking about how to talk about the different missions that the Foster does. Among the NOAA fleet, we probably have the most varied types of missions of all the ships. We do a lot of dive support operations, deploying ROVs or remotely operated vehicles down to check out coral and wrecks and stuff like that. We do a lot of seafloor mapping and then basic oceanography and some fisheries work too. So I'll just run through what would be a typical cruise that we would be on. That we'd be doing things like mapping at night, and then deploying divers and ROVs during the day, and then in the middle of all that, sending down instruments to do oceanography. So starting out with mapping. Mapping is really sort of the core of what we do. Since my job is not as a scientist, it's more science support, I really I've been learning a lot about the ship's systems and the instruments that are attached to the ship that we're responsible for. And multi-beam sonars are probably the most exciting piece of technology I've come across in quite a while. They're incredibly advanced and really complex, and they work. It's remarkable the kind of data they can produce, but they do they take some minding constantly while we're underway. So this is most of the time on a mapping cruise, sort of what the dry lab looks like. It's I'd normally be standing there tending the acquisition station, and then one of the science party, or sometimes I'm bouncing back and forth between the two, processing the data as it comes aboard. Here we are. Here's a group of scientists here. We're going over some data processing, so they can actually, or we can take the data and then look at individual pings along the seafloor and look for any errors or sort of anomalous information to clean it out and produce a nice smooth and realistic surface. And so there's a lot of time spent doing that. Even after the scientists leave the ship, they're spending a lot of time going over the data, cleaning it up. And so it happens at sea, and then it also happens, there's lots of steps after the fact. This scientist here, it was on this cruise, he's a physical scientist with the Office of Coast Survey, and he had actually worked as an ROV technician on the YTTs when they were based in Seattle. So he came on the ship, and he was looking around the lab, and he was telling us where all the where they were set up for all the hardware for launching torpedoes. He said mostly it was pretty top secret stuff, but he came full circle. It was he had a lot of great stories. So this is here's the setup. We spent a lot of time staring at it. So it is like a lot of things. Computers all the time. We have our multi-beam terminal. This is the live feed from the system itself. We're down in the dry lab on the main level, but 3 decks up. The crew are steering the ship based on a plan that we put together with the scientists. And this screen here is actually mirrored up to them, and so they'll drive the ship based on our plan. And we have a radio here to be in constant communication with them. And then we have some other sonar systems, and then some processing system computers for we have to take sound speed measurements as we map to make sure that the data is accurate. So this is the core of what we're watching constantly. The dynamics of sound and water are really interesting, and if anyone, if we want to chat about it afterwards, it's really interesting. But and I'd love to dive into it if anyone wants to know. But this right here is, if you imagine you're swimming below the ship in the same direction that the ship is traveling, the sound, the sonar sends out a ping, and propagates through the water, and then it bounces back and comes back to the ship. The receive array for the sonar system is composed of multiple units, and it's and with all the advent of a lot of high-powered computing that can go to sea, they can slice this ping as it's coming back, determine its direction with respect to the ship, and slice it up into 256 individual beams or pings. And so you send one ping into the water, and then it can listen continuously, and then along these channels, 256 of them, and then listen for the return from the sea bottom as it comes back to the ship. So you see over here, you send a ping out. This is a much longer distance for the sound to travel as it strikes the bottom and comes back to the ship than this here, as it comes down, strikes the bottom, and comes back to the ship. And so the computing power has allowed it to take and analyze the sound that's coming in continuously, slice it up, and then produce this wide swath. In this instance, the ship is mapping in depth of 4,767 meters, so that's some over 13,000 feet deep or more. And the swath width is somewhere along the lines of, let's see, we have, it's about 9 kilometers wide. So the ship is cruising along out in the open ocean, sending a ping, and I can read it here in this, let's see, about once every 10 seconds, sends a big low frequency ping into the water, bounces off, comes back, and you get a slice of the sea floor, and then it just stacks those slices up as it goes, and you produce these big 3D images. But as the sound is traveling through the water along these outer beams, as it passes through parts of the water that are different density, different salinity, different temperature, at the interfaces, those beams will bend. And so we can stand here and watch the sonar as it runs, but we constantly have to be taking in oceanographic data to make sure this is accurate. And so that's we have to do a lot of sound speed velocity casts, where we actually send a probe to the bottom, measure the sound speed, and then bring it up, retrieve the data, and then put it into this system. And so we can, and the instruments we use for that are called CTDs. So when we're mapping, we're always doing CTDs, which CTD stands for conductivity, temperature, and depth is the sort of the core set of physical oceanographic measurements that all research ships conduct. Otherwise, this seafloor here along the bottom is the return from the seafloor. It would have big wings and waves in it as the data came back. So a lot of time is that I spend staring at this thing, and then if something's not working right, sort of scratching my head, trying to figure out is it the equipment, is it some environmental condition, do we need to update our sound velocity casts? It can be a little bit. It's so sensitive, and there's so many variables. It can be pretty frustrating, but it's really interesting. Here's a slice of that water column on a different cruise. So here you see the bright return at the bottom, and you have all these little features coming up here, and those are methane seeps that are coming up out of the sediment. Along the East Coast, there are a lot of areas where sediment is washed out and piled over organic matter, and you have methane seeping up out of the bottom. They're targets for oil and gas exploration, but they're also targets for interesting deep water habitats that scientists are interested in for discovery and conservation purposes. And one of the things on some cruises, if it's their interest, we'll cruise around monitoring for these seeps, and then when we find them, we can come back around and maybe send an RV down to the bottom and see what's down there. So here, once we, so that's the sort of the real-time part of my job, is just standing there watching those computers. But these are some of the products that the scientists will produce from that data, and I really like this one. This was from a project that Foster did last fall off the coast of the Carolinas. It was an area that hadn't been mapped for nautical charts, and so looking at this, the red is the shallower areas, and down here in the dark blue is the deepest part of the surface. And this is and here's the depth range here. So the purple up here is about 158 meters deep, so 500 feet, somewhere in that area. And then down at the bottom, we're down to 250 meters, so 800 feet in the neighborhood. So it's a pretty good range. And if I remember right, the swath width, which is the width of that scan coming along the bottom, we were about 600 meters wide in this middle area. And these little sawtooth pieces, or where the ship comes along, we're driving, we're collecting data, and then we stop collecting data, we turn the ship, we come around, and we start again. And so that's that hard, right when the sonar starts up, so we get this sawtooth edge there. So what are we looking at? It's a real fine, sandy, silty sediment bottom that extends off of the coastal plain, and there are all these ditches that are all over the place. And we were trying to, these sort of images develop slowly as we're underway, and we'd cross one, and you'd see this divot in the bottom return in the sonar, and you think, well, that was kind of a strange little feature in this wide open plain. And then you'd come around on the next line, and you see the same divot, and they would start to line up. And so here's 1 nautical mile here for the scale, and so we're maybe 8 nautical miles across here, and we're traveling at about 4 knots as we go. So you see something funny, and then you come back, a couple hours later, and see it again, and it's sort of this up and down shift. But some scientists down in Charleston noticed these on different mapping projects, and they have a working theory that these are iceberg scours from the breakup of the last ice age. And so currents were running differently at that time. The Gulf Stream wasn't sweeping up the East Coast, and as the glaciers were breaking down the poles, we had these cold water masses full of big icebergs that were sweeping down, and then they'd get carried along and then get lodged in these fine sediments. And then, so you can see some of them kind of wiggle here and there. And then here you have a really big one that comes right across, and there are little shallow spots on each side. And it looks like someone just drug, a shovel through the sediment and then peeled it up on both sides. And they're all over the place, more in the deeper water. And then there are smaller ones here, but the larger ones are down the deeper water. And in some areas that aren't on this image, you can see where they came. It looks like they kind of got stuck and then just sat and melted. And other ones came and then got stuck, and then maybe the currents shifted and then they started heading towards shore. These little wiggles, I was wondering if maybe that's the effect of the tide, sort of pushing these icebergs in and out as they go. So, that's the part of the job that's really exciting to me, is that I had never seen iceberg scours before. I'm not a geologist, but getting to watch these images, sort of come together over the course of the trip, and then have all the scientists there pointing everything out. It's really exciting, and as long as I don't mess up and start losing data, that's my biggest concern. We can keep getting these images. So this is all this data is then going to go into nautical charts for shipping lanes up and down the East Coast, stuff like that. Here's another sonar image from an area off the coast of North Carolina, Cape Hatteras, the famed graveyard of the Atlantic, called such because the waters around there are really treacherous. They're long, sandy shoals that extend out quite a ways offshore, and then in World War II, the cargo vessels crossing, rounding Cape Hatteras, there was sort of a choke point where it moved quite a ways offshore, but you didn't want to go too offshore because the conditions are bad, and you want to make your trip as soon as possible, because there were U-boats patrolling the coast, and so the U-boats would hang out there and then at that choke point, and then sink convoys carrying cargo up and down the East Coast. This is a German submarine, German U-boat, U-576 it's called, and it was sank by a U.S. destroyer while it was attacking a convoy off the coast of Cape Hatteras. And one of the Nancy Foster does a lot of work in support of national marine sanctuaries, and so doing dive support and mapping. And this was a project looking at U-576 in particular, but also the freighter that U-576 sank in the convoy. I didn't have an image, a wider field image, but we mapped a large area, and U-576 was lying at the bottom, and about a quarter mile away, lying parallel to U-576 on the bottom, was the freighter Bluefield, and so U-576 sank the Bluefields. A destroyer showed up and responded, and sank U-576, and it's quite dramatic, to be cruising and see these wrecks, littering the bottom in these wide sandy expanses. So this is and it's also remarkable the kind of images you can get from modern multi-beam sonar systems these days. Here's another wreck. This was an image I was involved in gathering the data for this image. This is from World War I. I didn't know there were U-boats patrolling the U.S. coast during World War I. This is the freighter Merak, and a U-boat had attacked a ship, a light ship, near the Merak, and then the Merak, in trying to escape, I believe it ran aground, and the U-boat pulled up, informed the crew, that they were in trouble, and they intended to sink the ship. They let the crew embark on their life rafts, asked if they had a sail available, pointed them in the direction of shore, and then boarded the ship, placed charges in the bilge of the ship, blew it in half, and sank it. And so that's the wreck of the Merak. There, you can see it's up on its it's lying upside down. This is the hull sticking up here. But one of the real neat things about this image that I really get a kick out of is this big blue area is a big deep trough, and it's on the lee side of the predominant current that's traveling north east over the area, and that's the Gulf Stream. So this area is shallow enough that the Gulf Stream is just constantly sweeping over it, and then it's just sort of eroded the sand around it and kept the wreck clean and exposed. And you can see there's sand waves all around. So we map those sites looking at for archaeological purposes, and divers from the Monitor Marine Sanctuary in the area will go down there to gather data. But also they're really important fish habitats. So on a lot of these projects, we'll have multiple science parties. That some will be looking at the wrecks themselves, and others will be looking at sort of the ecosystems around these wrecks. And it's in the multi-beam sonar. If you imagine that the fan that's spread out, and you can see the bottom, all the blue above that surface. The multi-beam is gathering information on everything that's floating in the water. And so when we drive over these, oftentimes you'll see these big plumes above the vessels, and they'll move. Their position will change, what time of day it is, and those are the local fish schools that congregate at the wrecks. And so for commercial fisheries and really for recreational fisheries, the wrecks are important, and that's keeping track of those is and learning more about the fish behavior, which fish are where and how are they doing and where are they moving to. A lot of the scientists are interested in a lot of those sites. And so yeah, that's the wreck of the Mira. And they're if you ever any of you guys have an opportunity to look at the Modern National Marine Sanctuary website, there are a lot of really great images from there. Some from the Foster. And then there's a lot of time spent staring at a computer, but I usually work the night shift, so usually around sunrise I get to head outside on the deck and get a break, get a breath of fresh air, and then head back in. So normally I get up at midnight, go right into mapping operations, and work until about breakfast time. Most of the science crew gets up, and then and the sun's coming up, and we're gearing up for oceanographic and or dive operations. And so CTDs. So if I'm not in the working in the lab, the dry lab, most likely my job is working out on deck, and CTDs is the core instrument for that. So it's conductivity. We convert conductivity to salinity. We measure temperature, and then we measure pressure and convert that to depth. And so here's a CTD. This is a really expensive instrument. It's a solid or it's a hollow titanium tube that's stacked with custom printed circuit boards and lots of input and output ports. And it's sort of modular. There are different sensors and pumps mounted all over the place, and they can be configured in a bunch of different ways. And so a big part of my job, along with my supervisor, is making sure these run properly and are gathering accurate data. And so here's some of the other bits and pieces. So these are sensors here. This is another sensor. This is a dissolved oxygen sensor. It's really sensitive, and it's pumped. And this equipment is rated down to 10,500 meters, so you can do full ocean depth cast with these. So we don't go that far out, but these are the same kind of instruments that a ship like the Ron Brown would take out and to deep ocean basins. And here's the unit strapped into a water sampling carousel. So everything's modular. We're responsible for, in the survey department, keeping all this stuff in good working order. So when the scientists show up, they know they're going to get good data. And then here it is. Here's a similar instrument being deployed. This is another survey tech on the Nancy Foster. This is before I showed up. I don't have any pictures of myself doing this, but here's the CTD assembly dangling here, and then all the water sample bottles here. So when we are conducting science operations, my job is to supervise the deployment of all the oceanographic equipment, and get a lot of help from the deck department, and also the scientists who are involved in it too. So some trips, we're on deck the majority of time, and other trips are sort of a mix depending on the project. So it gets sent over the side, dunked in the water, and then that system there has a continuous feed of data that comes back to the ship, and so we can monitor that in real time. And so I set up a let's see if I can get it here. I have some archive data to run through. Sorry. So this is the CTD cast that we did, and so if you look here, this is the surface, and this is the bottom of the cast here. And what we're looking at is measuring, there's the depth, the blue is temperature, and the orange is conductivity. And so higher temperature and conductivity that way, lower temperature and conductivity this way. And so as the probe descends, temperature and conductivity, they really they track closely with one another, and they're both kind of heading down. So the water's getting more fresh and it's getting colder as we go down. And the bottom here is about 300 meters. But if you notice, there are these little jags and bumps, and then these areas like here where you have, it really takes temperature and conductivity really decrease really sharply, and then they kind of stabilize a little bit. Scientists take this type of data, and they use that to identify different water masses in the water column. And so this is a shallow cast. We would use this for determining the entering the sound velocity into the sonars, but also giving it to the scientists for their research. But casts like these, much deeper, looking at the full ocean depth, this is the kind of data that scientists use to put together and learn about the large-scale ocean currents. How large water masses are shifting. Cold water is cooling and sinking at the poles, and then traveling along the bottom of deep ocean basins and coming up along the coastlines of continents and other places. And so these kind of data sets are at the core of that science. And so it's still, CTD still are the workhorse of physical oceanography. And so I find them to be really stressful myself because the equipment is very expensive. You're dangling it over the bottom on a wire. It's running about 400 volts of electricity down it, or real-time communication. And if you hit the bottom, you can really follow up the data. You can follow up the equipment, and then you have to do it all over again after that. So it's not. My coworker is cool as a cucumber when we're doing CTDs, but they can get kind of dicey. Sometimes at these boundaries, you can have a pretty dramatic shift in current, and so the CTD is going down, and it passes through one of those boundaries, and the current starts to carry it away. And the ship is trying to move. It's not trying to hold a stationary position with respect to the seafloor as it sends it down, but it's trying to hold stationary with respect to the water. And so we try to drift with the current. So if you're drifting along the surface current and the probe punches through to a different layer, and it's moving in a different direction, or maybe not moving at all, the wire will start to move around, and the officers have to work quickly to correct for that, and then make sure we have a good vertical cast. Otherwise, and sometimes conditions can get really strange really quickly, and the wire will stretch way out, and then if you know the bottom's down here, you're trying to get there, the CTD might stall at this depth because it's just being carried away from the ship on the wire. So in that case, you bring it back up and hope nothing's broken. I have hit the bottom before. I don't want to do it again. And we'll get back to the slideshow. So that was, so for CTD data acquisition, I'll come out with a science party. This is a great benefit of the job, but you get to come out and get a view of the water, put the instrument in, and then run back inside, fire up all the systems, and then wait anxiously to see if the data is good, and then come back out and retrieve the instrument. And then the scientists can come if they have water samples that they collected. They have free reign to gather all that stuff. But it's a pretty involved process. A lot of there's work on deck and then work in the lab. When we're mapping, we have a much smaller CTD. This one is a lot simpler. It's much lighter weight. It's probably it only has one little probe that hangs from a 500-pound test braided line, and it doesn't have any real-time data. So we send it over. We throw it over the ship, the stern of the ship. It sinks down, gathers data. We bring it up. We come in and download the data, and that's primarily just when we're mapping, and so we pump that data into the multi-beam, and away we go. It is more simpler. It's much faster. You get a nice view hanging out on the stern of the ship. Here's a picture of myself and one of the scientists from the National Data Archive for NOAA, there's no real-time data, and it's just a tiny little string. And the concern with this one is that you're never going to get the probe back. And so, so imagine a fairly expensive piece of equipment, and then add a couple zeros to the end of the cost of that, and then just chuck it in the ocean while you're traveling. It can be it's fun, but it's I tend to be really anxious about it. And then you get to have a nice view of the water. That's pretty much everything that I do on the ship revolves around trying to get outside and get a view of a sunrise or a sunset. Small boat and diving operations. So once we're done mapping and gathering CTT data, oftentimes during the day, the Foster will start on our dive operations. And here's a view of the ship moored in Savannah, on the Savannah River. And so we have 3 little small boats here. And so we can take a science party of up to about 14 people. And then so we can probably take about in those 3 boats, for a day, we'll take 10 scientists out, and they'll dive from between breakfast and lunch, come back to the ship, and then head out in the evening, and we'll go for a 2-week trip sometimes, and they're just diving every day as long as the weather and conditions will permit. And it's a really exciting part of the job because there's a lot of work on deck involved, and it seems. And they bring back lots of interesting specimens and videos. And I have to give you an idea of the work when we're underway doing dive operations. I have a video of my co-worker Cody Higgins. He put this together. He's one of the deckhands on the ship, and the chief bosun is running the crane. Greg Walker is his name, and so crane swings over, grabs the boat, picks it up, and brings it to the rail. And if you watch we all scurry around, and then the divers, they drop it in the water, and then the divers run over, and then hop on board, and there they go, and then away they go for the day. And then we run around, pick up another boat, bring it to the rail. And so we'll do this 4 times a day. Sometimes if we're shifting positions, or sometimes small boats have problems, or the scientists might forget something, or the weather turns bad. We're bringing people on and off much more frequently. But it's a really good time. And it's nice to be out there. And if the weather's bad, usually dive ops are suspended. So we kind of if you're doing dive ops, it's usually pretty nice. But it's stop there. And then go back to and then this is a picture taken from one of the small boats. So the Nancy Foster is she'll sit between the different dive sites and act as a communications relay. They have the big radars, so we can see any boats that are coming and going, and then keep an eye on everyone. If there are any problems, the Foster, she can run right over the small boat, or everyone mostly returns to her at the end of the day. And so hopefully I'll be able to get on small boats more as I move along in the job. But and ROVs, and that's another big part of a lot of our core projects. And ROVs stand for remotely operated vehicles, basically a submarine with no people on board that's attached to the vessel by a tether, where we're getting real-time data. And so here's one of the ROVs that commonly comes aboard the Foster. So it has some thrusters, a float, and then there's some weights down below. It tries to be neutrally buoyant, and then a bunch of lights and cameras on the front. And then here is the tether that attaches it to the ship. So the deck department will lower it into the water, release it from the crane. They'll send a weight down to the bottom, and that'll carry the tether with it. And so you don't have a whole lot of wire swinging around in the current. It sort of stabilizes the ROV. And the ship will actually travel along with the ROV as it moves, and so the ship is able to hold its position and orientation, and even kind of creep sideways through the water as the ROV travels along, looking for whatever it is they're looking for. A lot of the studies that we are involved in are for ecosystem maps, where we'll run over an area with the multi-beam sonar, put together these high-resolution maps, and then the ROV will go down during the day, see what kind of stuff is living down there in certain areas at certain depths, and then they'll cross-reference the data to produce ecosystem maps of the whole area that we map, so they can selectively choose points to gather data with the ROV and then expand that information out to the entire area. And so one of the projects we're on is actually, they've been running for 15 years now, and putting together maps of all of the coral communities in the Caribbean, as many as they can, and then also coming back to certain areas when the technology gets better, remapping them, seeing if there are any things that have changed, and also and then getting finer resolution imagery. So it's a lot of NOAA projects are continuous, ongoing projects. They're monitoring things that are important to the local economy and to the environment. So here's the ROV cruising away from the ship here, and they'll get out a little ways, and then they'll just there's a little propeller that just sinks, goes straight down to the bottom and starts gathering video. So, and when ROV operations are underway, if we're not having any problems with the equipment, or if there isn't any data to be cleaned or archived, sometimes we get to hang around and watch a live feed of the ROV. They'll beam it on the ship's TV system. So this is here's some of the scientists, and we're hanging out in the dry lab here. But if you go into the galley to grab a cup of coffee, oftentimes the TV will have the live feed from the ROV on there. And so here's an image from that from the ROV. These lasers are parallel lasers that are set distance apart, so that you can get an idea of the scale of different objects. It's about 10 centimeters. This is a cluster of sea urchins down off the coast of Puerto Rico. And then they'll move, on this project in particular, they start deep, and then they just drive straight up, they just bring the coral, or the ROV straight up the upslope towards shore, and they just sort of tracking at what depths different corals appear. And they get a lot of great images like this, close-up pictures of coral communities where they can identify different corals, and then they'll get wide-angle shots that they can get an idea of the extent of some of these coral communities, and also get an idea of what kind of fish are living down there. And this is a composite image that the ship would produce on a mission like that. So this is off the east coast of St. Croix, and this in the red here is a big shallow area. So this scale up there is the red shallow, and then there's no purple, but head down to the yellows and greens, it gets much deeper. So and so the ROV will work its way up slope, and then this is actually sort of a wall that these coral reefs build up, and they'll climb up the wall, and then this is a big flat lagoon type of bank. It's called Lang Bank, and so we're looking at probably down to about 1,200 meters down here in the blue, and then up top here we might be 30 meters deep here. And so this is quite a large scale image, but these are the kind of things that the scientists are putting together, and then knowing all the different coral communities in the area. And so yeah, that's what I have to say about that. And then there you also get to go, after you've spent the day watching the ROV, go transit to another spot, and you could go hang on the bow and watch dolphins and do some bow riding. So there's sunrises, sunsets, dolphin watching. It's pretty great. So, let's see. Yeah. So that's sort of a run through on what one of our more common types of trips would entail. So we would be underway for 2 weeks, 12 days, 2 weeks at a time. We'll pull into a port for a couple days and then head back out. The Foster, the crew's about 22 people, and then we can take on 14, 15 scientists, and so it gets pretty crowded, but it's real great, great place to work. Does anyone have any questions now, or good?
Put my mask on.
Oh yeah, sure.
Well, this program, is got nationwide exposure. I want you to know that. So I have a couple questions from someone who works at the National Weather Service in Caribou, Maine. Okay, these are easy. What's the worst seas you've been in, and what type of weather is the biggest danger?
The worst seas that I've been in on a NOAA ship. Did I jump ahead? I'm sorry, Teresa.
No, that's
good. The Nancy Foster, on the Nancy Foster in particular, she's 184 feet long, draws 11 feet, and has a fairly flat bottom. And so when we're looking at weather forecasts, we like to, as a rule of thumb, say, take this predicted wave height and then double it, and that's how it feels when you're out on the Nancy Foster. So 6 feet feels like 12 feet, and that can be 12 feet is a pretty rough ride. The worst weather I've been on a NOAA ship would probably be aboard the Henry Bigelow, which is one of the fishery ships that I showed earlier, and that's little, let's see, I think they're about 205 feet long. They have a much deeper draft, and we were off the coast. We were doing a fisheries project working from Cape Hatteras all the way up to Gulf of Maine, and it was a rough it was springtime. It was a rough season for nor'easters, and we just kept getting hammered by storm after storm. It seemed like every week would be a new storm, and we saw when we were making a run for shore, the wind was coming from the northeast. There was no protection, and we saw 25-foot seas there. And that was pretty uncomfortable. So,
One of the follow-up questions: how do you chart a course to avoid bad weather? Like when you leave port.
Oh,
So how do you really set the course?
yeah, that's the command and the officer corps are really involved in that. They're getting information from the National Weather Service, and they also get location-specific forecasts from the Navy. The Navy also has their own forecasting operation, so they use those together to come up with a plan of action. And on one of the cruises we did, the mapping cruise where we saw all the iceberg scours, we actually had an incident meteorologist that normally deploys to work on forest fires. IMET, they call him. He was able to deploy to the NOAA ship on that Foster. I think it might have been the first IMET that had deployed on a NOAA ship, and he did a really great job of generating daily forecasts and then risk assessments based on the forecast for our specific location. And I think that's something that NOAA, the command really appreciated, and they took some of the tools that he had, and I think they're going to be incorporating more of those. And so it's really day-to-day, it seems to me anyway, I'm not as involved in it as the command, but it seems like there are day-to-day decisions being made on the local weather, and then everyone's sort of aware of weather all the time and coming up with a long-term plan for things like hurricanes and larger systems. And you get out there and you start talking about the food, and you start talking about the weather, and so everyone's sort of coming up with their own plan.
And the final one: do you do any weather observations or relay any of the information routinely to the National Weather Service?
Yeah, I'm not, so the ship, so in addition to carrying all of our oceanographic equipment, the CTDs, the multi-beam sonar, we also have quite a few meteorological sensors. We have wind sensors in the rigging, we have high quality temperature, pressure, and relative humidity sensors. And those are all gathering data continuously in real time. And so those are packaged in different sized bundles and sent off daily to different users. And I'm not sure the frequency of our reporting to the National Weather Service, but we are continuously sending data to the National Weather Service. I've seen that when the IMET came out, he showed us a map of all the different data point sources in the area that the National Weather Service was taking in, and there was you could see a little point, and then a wind vane, giving the position or the direction and speed of the wind at that time. And that was our sensors, and so it was feeding into their models. So it's,
Well, that's from the National Weather Service in Caribou.
oh, okay, all right.
That's
Caribou. Yeah. So,
I have a question. Earlier you said that you could talk more about the dynamics of sound in water. What's the difference between the way sound moves through water and the way sound moves through air?
oh yeah. Well, they're really similar, but it's sound travels much faster through the water. So if you imagine in a body of water, all the molecules it's a liquid, so all the molecules are bumped up against one another. And so how the sonar system works is you apply a current to a special type of ceramic, and it vibrates, and then so it pushes on the water, and that pressure wave then propagates as it gets passed from molecule to molecule. Propagates through the water, just sort of, as if we're a long line of people and I push the person in front of me and they push the person, and so on and so on. In air, the molecules are more spread out, so you smack a molecule in the air and it picks up that energy and then goes careening off, and then it might be a little bit until it runs into another molecule in the air and then gets passed along. And so because water is much more densely packed, the sound travels much faster. For how sound is affected by the changes in density and temperature are also very similar in air and water. If I think one way I imagine how sound bends at these interfaces between, say, a very warm water mass and a cold water mass is that the sound is traveling at an angle, and if it's warm water, it's moving much more quickly. Sound speed in water tends to be how fast it's traveling tends to be dominated by the temperature, but salinity and density also affect it. That's why we have to take all those measurements for the CTD. But so the water's traveling along at an angle, and if you have two sound rays, I guess, that are passing parallel to one another, one is going to hit that boundary first, and it's going to slow down, and then this other ray that's traveling is going to continue on a little bit farther before it hits, and it's going to slow down, and so if they're both traveling together sort of as a wave, you'll see the wave coming down here, and the bottom part starts to slow down, and the top will continue speeding along until it hits, and so they'll be parallel still, but the face of that wave as it's traveling along will sort of shift and flatten out, and then pass down and maintain that angle. And so if you visualize sound traveling through water, it sort of just kind of does this, as it's traveling along these angles. And so the multi-beam system, one of the most amazing things about it is that it takes that sound velocity, casts all those different angles, and it just imagines, a ray of sound pointing at a certain angle, and then using a lot of raw computational power, it can just predict how that's going to be steered as it passes through all of those layers, hits the bottom, gets reflected, it's coming back much fainter, and then follows the same path all the way back to the receiver. And so if you just imagine it going in a straight line, it might say, okay, the bottom is over here, but in fact, it's turned and then, impacted here, and then it's come back along that line. And so it's really, really important to know what the sound, the conditions are in the water for predicting that ray of sound as it passes through. And it does that in real time for 256 beams of sound. And some of our systems are pinging it, multiple times per second, just a constant tick, 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 tick. It's really remarkable.
So you calibrate it then to get the baseline of the.
Yeah, and so we have the systems are so sensitive that they have to know the speed of sound right at the transducer face. So there's a sensor that sits there right at the same level, and it's actively measuring the sound speed. It's a little transducer reflector, and it just shoots the sound waves back and forth. It's probably about that wide, and so it knows exactly what the sound speed is all the time at the transducer face. And then every, depending on the conditions, every 1 hour to every 4 hours, we go out and we do a cast to get a new sound speed profile, and then load that into the computer. And it can be, I was mentioning the instrument that we throw over the side, and it doesn't have a real-time feed. It's just it's a sensor on a really strong fishing line, and so we have an approximate idea how fast it's sinking, and so we have a stopwatch. So when you deploy it, you let it go. As soon as it hits the water, you hit the stopwatch, and you're trying to get it to within 10 meters of the bottom, because that last little 10 meters, things can happen, or if you don't get within that last little 10 meters, if you're 30 meters, say, you can have variations. And on the going back to the cruise with those iceberg scours, and some of those deep troughs, when we were working, as the ship passed over those, we didn't know the troughs were there to begin with, so we were using sound velocity casts from maybe a shallower part, and then we'd drive over this deep section, and the surface that would start to look all weird. The edges would turn up and everything, and we thought our calibration was good, and so we steered back around, and we sent a probe as far down to the bottom as we could, and we got within 5 meters of the bottom, and right in that last 20-meter zone. If you imagine that the CTD cast coming down, it came down normally and everything's going fine, and then there was this spike where the temperature dropped really rapidly. And so we were in an area that was predominated by the Gulf Stream, so it was pretty warm, but there was this cold mass that sort of moved up and down, like the tide, probably maybe even with the tide. And then so when we passed over those deeper areas, our data would get all weird, so we really had to go after that.
So is anybody studying an ecosystem within those troughs that you discovered?
Those troughs in particular, I'm not sure, but there are science groups that for NOAA, and also projects for the National Science Foundation that are looking at the ecology in these deep canyons, because they're deep, and and there are a lot of different features for organisms to exist in, but there's also a lot of transport of sediments down through these canyons as they run offshore, and so they're really dynamic environments. And,
Yeah.
I was on board a cruise on the NOAA ship Ron Brown, the big one that goes around the world, and they were really interested in sending an ROV down into these really deep canyons and looking at the communities that lived along these canyon walls, and it was fun to watch. Yeah, the NOAA ship Okeanos Explorer is a NOAA ship that's devoted to just basic exploration of these uncharted and unknown areas of the seafloor, and they have some really great ROV systems, and then some really great sonar systems too. And they'll map an area, find something that looks interesting, send the ROV down, and they've made some interesting discoveries along the Atlantic seaboard of finding these deep water coral communities that people hadn't encountered before, and those are significant discoveries in terms of biological oceanography.
So-
That's exciting.
Go ahead, Mark.
When you're out on the water, are you working every day, your days off, or when you're on shore?
Yeah. When we go to sea, it's for the project every day is a work day. So the Foster, our limit is how much food we can carry. So 14 days is about as long as we can stay out. But yeah, the scientists, they spend a lot of time gearing up for these missions, and then when we get out, if the ship isn't working, it's time, data lost. And so we try and pack as much stuff in as possible. So it's pretty exciting.
Technical question. So you said there are 256 channels. So are those different frequencies, or are they different beams, or?
256 channels in the multi-beam array. Yeah.
So
It's
they're different frequencies?
No, they're all the same frequency, and it's I guess I don't know if I can explain it very clearly, but so there are two. There's a transmit array in the sonar system, and there's a receive array, and they're oriented differently, at 90 degrees to one another. And so the transmit array will send out a ping, and it's oriented lengthwise along the ship, and all those individual elements in the array use constructive interference to shape the beam, the sound as it travels through the water, and causes it to fan out approximately 90 degrees across the width of the ship. And so you have one sound ping, one frequency. Well, the ping itself might vary in its, it might not be a single frequency for the ping. It might increase or decrease depending on the type, the conditions. But you have one ping that goes out into the water, and that bounces back. And then the receive array is oriented 90 degrees to that, and so it's listening. It's a little hard to imagine, but so it's using the same principles of physics of beamforming that the transmit array uses, and so it allows it to listen along a slice that is in line with the ship. And so the sound comes out across the ship. The receive array is listening to a slice that's going with the length of the ship, and then what the receive array does is it listens continuously, and then depending on the angle that the sound is coming in, it slices the sound input as it comes into each array at different times. So if you have sound that's coming in at 45 degree angles, say, it's going to impact this cell in the array before it affects this one. And since it knows the speed of sound at the transducer face, it knows the time delay between when the sound wave, as it's coming up, hits here and then finishes here. And so it takes it listening continuously and then slicing the data, and then it's able to separate out based on just the timing 256 beams. It's really remarkable that
They
it's
set
one
a time.
Yeah, one ping and then
Thank you.
yeah. Well, so it's sort of I guess they call it sort of like a phased array, like they would a radar that's stationary but can still steer its radar beam around. It does the same thing but with sound.
So Ben, I don't see any questions on chat. Are there any more questions in the room?
No.
Well then, thank
Yeah.
you, Ben.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for coming, everyone.
Thanks for sharing with us.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Sounds
I-
exciting.
I-